Hi, this is Jim from Trek World, and over the years there has been no better example of brand association than what existed between the Mego Toy Corporation and Star Trek in the 1970s. So join me after the break as we take a look at the single most iconic line of Star Trek merchandise ever produced. After watching this video, please remember to check out our channel for these other great videos. Also, please be sure to like this video so that YouTube will offer it to more people. Lastly, please consider becoming a VIP supporter via our Patreon site using the link below in the description. But before we continue, I want to thank these sites for being the standard bearers for all things Mego. This is the second in our series of videos on the 1970s series of Mego toys for the original Star Trek television show. The first video covered the 1974 release of the original 5 characters. In this video, we're going to take a look at the addition of another crew member and a group of aliens that were released in 2 waves.
Dr. Bones McCoy, caring for their health and welfare. Scotty, chief engineer. Mr. Spock, the Vulcan first officer. Lieutenant Uhura, the communications officer. And, new for 1976, the aliens, Klingon.
Do you say Klingons?
Their evil threatens the universe. Gorn, half human, half beast. Charon, is he good or evil? Neptunian, dangerous in space and in his own watery habitat. And the Keeper, his incredible intellect threatens the Enterprise. The Star Trek aliens.
Now, it is worth mentioning that every time Mego released a new wave of action figures, it reprinted the original 5 that were done in 1974. And you can spot one of the ones that was maybe printed in 75 or 76 by a handful of changes on the packaging. First and foremost, if you look up at the top left-hand side of the card here, where Jim Kirk is, you're going to see that the logo is no longer white, it is blue. You'll also notice that they decided to print his name in purple. Also, notice that the front of the card now has 6 cartoon caricature characters, not 5. Lieutenant Uhura is now on this card. We'll get to in a moment why she's there. Now, note, I'm not really going to get into what the average buying and selling price of these figures are at this point, because to be perfectly honest, anything beyond the very first 5, all the reprints that happened, as well as reprints that happened way even into the 2000s, really muddied the waters and have a very difficult time trying to identify which wave it is in. So if you go searching on eBay for prices, they are all over the place. Okay, the second one is Mr. Spock, and like we saw with Kirk, they are using actually a blue logo for Star Trek, but instead of purple, they stuck with the regular white characters for Spock. Next up, we take a look at Dr. McCoy, again blue logo, and again yet another color change. Dr. McCoy's name is in green. And next up, we have Mr. Scott, and like we'd seen with the previous characters, his logo is also blue now. His name still says Scotty. And of course, our friend the Klingon is back, also with a blue logo, and this time a yellow name. Okay, so now we come to probably the biggest reason why this wave even came out. And that was the decision was made in Series 2 to add an additional crew member. They had their options of Sulu, Chekhov, or Uhura. Realizing at the time just how popular dolls of this size were for little girls, Mego wisely decided to add Uhura to see if they could sell into that market with their Star Trek franchise. Okay, I need to tell you before we go any further about some things that exist in Star Trek fandom that if you encounter a Star Trek fan and you say something perfectly innocently, you might actually discover an overly emotional response. Okay? First and foremost, don't assume that I'm a Star Wars fan just because I like Star Trek. I absolutely love the fact that in Big Bang Theory, Penny actually said,
They get all cranky when you mix the two up.
thought that was pretty good. Secondly, the Mego dolls are actually Mego action figures. They're not Mego dolls. Okay. Let's talk about what that really means. All right. Dolls have been around forever, and for the most part, they've always been aimed at little girls. But then in 1964, about the same time that we were building the model of the Starship Enterprise that was going to end up being the prop, Hasbro released its very first doll aimed at little boys. And they made the determination right then and there they were not going to use the word doll because boys wouldn't play with dolls. So they invented the phrase action figure.
G.I. Joe, G.I. Joe, fighting man from head to toe, on the land, on the sea, in the air.
G.I. Joe attack!
And what you see here is actually the original 1964 G.I. Joe action, and they'll say action soldier, action sailor. They use the word action everywhere, but doll was eradicated. Action figure was created to sell to little boys. You'll notice they changed the back of the cards too. The cards have been changed now so that on the back of the cards they can show you that they're selling things other than action figures. We see for the first time on these cards, we see the USS Enterprise bridge set and the communicators that they were just getting ready to launch in 1976. Now, before we close the door on these particular series of action figures, I want to point out that Kirk, Spock, McCoy, and the Klingon, no Scotty, were released in 1979 specifically for Sears. The idea was that maybe they could be sold in addition to whatever was going to be available for Star Trek the Motion Picture. And we're going to have a discussion on Star Trek the Motion Picture when we get to that point properly in season 2 of our show. But I will tell you this. The reason the 8-inch dolls disappeared and their play sets and everything else, and we'll talk about this in a future video, but they all disappeared because Paramount asked Mego to please hold off on promoting and creating anything new with the movie coming out. They wanted stuff created for the movie and not created for the TV series. So everything stopped for Mego in 1977. They did, in fact, make stuff for the movie, and we will talk about that in a future video. But that one decision pretty much doomed the entire franchise line for Mego. Now, if you're wondering, how do I find one of these, Jim? How do I look at one and go, okay, this is the 1979 reprint and not the 1976 or 75 reprints, even though it has the right color on the front for the logo, the names are in the same color you warned us about, but all of them are blank on the back side. And quite frankly, now they're usually referred to by the Mego fans as blank backs. Now, the other thing that was slightly different is in the beginning, when they first started making the run for Sears, they exhausted their supplies of the original Star Trek emblems that sit on the action figure's chest. So they went with something that's actually heat sealed directly to the fabric rather than stitched or glued. And it's real easy to spot them because they actually have this white edge that runs all along the edging of the insignia. A couple other observations before we pass off on this right now is that people who own these have reported that the pelvises on the blank backs are actually a flesh toned, and they were not on previous releases, and that Dr. McCoy's hair is a little bit darker in the Sears blank back than it is on all of the previous waves, and that's believed that maybe they used the same coloring that they used for the Kirk doll. So now in 1976, they produced what I call Wave 3. This was their first group of honest-to-goodness aliens and not crew members. After all, if you're going to play with action figures and you're a child, you need bad guys to really make it interesting. So the first thing we're going to look at here is the Gorn. Now, ironically, this thing resembles more Asmodeus from Gene Roddenberry's Spectre, but I understand where they're going with this. They actually already had a lizard head. There was a lizard man that was part of their superhero series. You can see the little side picture that I have it here. So they went ahead and they used that. The head is brown instead of green. They also went out and they used the Klingons' uniform and boots so they could slide it right up there. The Gorn was very, very easy for them to make. They didn't have to retool pretty much anything. And it was a little bit of a disappointment. However, guys, it was 1976. You probably were tickled death to have this thing no matter what, Now, it is actually pretty hard to get hold of. So if you find one of these still on the card, if you look at what I got here from eBay, they actually sold for $700 a piece. So I can understand why they're such a collectible. Now, the next alien that comes up was the alien from Let That Be Your Last Battlefield. And it needs to be noted that the half white portion of this suit has a tendency to color shift with age and look really, really bad. Jump out on Google, do an image search for the Charon from Star Trek Mego, and you'll see photographs of action figures still in their packaging. And the white looks anything but white. I've seen it look gold, I've seen it look rust. It seems to me that the color bleeds like all over the place from it. Worth just a tiny bit less than the Gorn, this little fellow sells regularly for $600. Next up is the Keeper. Maybe. What you're looking at here is a doll that is named after the Keeper, which of course were the Telosians in the cage and the menagerie. But the facial sculpt looks like Balok from Corbinite Maneuver. So I'm not really sure why they mixed them like that, but I will tell you, it was a really neat looking doll. The head sculpt was pretty wild. It was somewhat desirable. I remember wanting to have one and not having a prayer. However, because of its oddity, you'll see that this little fellow, the resale price takes a big ding. Even mint on card will drop down to about $300 a piece now. And of course, the last one in this set is the Neptunians. Now, this is interesting because this alien isn't based on anything in Star Trek. This was our friends at Mego just creating their own character and sticking the Star Trek logo on it and selling it. Now, the ultimate irony here is they were not the only company to do this. Remco and a lot of other people did it as well, but there is sort of legitimacy to it when you're looking at this particular action figure. It was part of their line. And it is kind of neat. So you'll see the average resale price now is right around $375 if you still have it in the box. Now, when they went and produced the remainder of these four, the backs of the alien cards contained all of the aliens and all of the characters now. And they also gave you little quadrants. You may remember the last card we saw had the communicators and the playset. Well, there's a lot more back here now. Let's take a look at what they actually have back here. From top left, going clockwise, we have the USS Enterprise playset, we have the Star Trek tricorder, and next up we have the Star Trek Tribble, which we've been told was never actually produced, period. But there are people who claim to have seen them. Now, nobody can produce one in a box, of course, so I guess the Mego Tribble is the Star Trek fandom equivalent of the unicorn. After that, we have the mission to Gamma 6, which we'll be reviewing later, and then the Star Trek Communicators, the Star Trek Command Console, the Star Trek Space Battle Game, which was really laser tag a good 20 years before anybody else thought about it, and we see the Star Trek Phaser Battle. So these were the back of the cards when they introduced this run of aliens. But they weren't done yet. In 1976, they decided, let's do four more. So the first one they put up is the Romulan. He was based very much off Mark Leonard's portrayal in Balance of Terror. And there's really not a whole lot to say to this. It's actually really, really, really well made. The helmet comes off. The detail is exquisite. It wasn't made in large numbers, and as a result of that, I've yet to find one that really sold on eBay. The going price, this guy right here at $29.99, that isn't even the highest. That's like mid-range. I've seen asking for as much as $3,000 to $5,000 for a mint copy of one of these. I've never seen anybody sell one, but I have heard that loose copies can go for as much as $1,000 at local conventions and stuff like that. So this guy is probably the single most collectible Star Trek action figure that Mego ever produced. Next up is the Andorian. There's not a whole lot you and I can say about that. Again, another really, really good body sculpt. The quality in these things for the last release were just absolutely amazing. As such, the retail price on this, when you go to buy them on eBay, sells regularly for about $500 a piece. This poor little guy pays the price for them screwing up with naming the keeper. Because as you and I both know, the keeper was really a Telosian. So they used Balok and gave him the Telosian name, and now they had the keeper, and they had to come up with something else. So they figured, well, he comes from Talos 4, so we'll just call him Talos. Uniform, I have no idea where they got that from. And it has an average resale of about $500 mint on card. I'm not going to get into the Mugato Gumato debate. Okay. You can thank DeForest Kelly for that. If you want to know the official reason for why that exists, you need to go in and you need to watch the video that I did called 5 Things That Star Trek Beamed Out of Outer Limits. In that video, it's going to introduce you to Janos Prohaska. And Janos is the man that actually appeared within the Megado. And that video contains me going over how things got so badly messed up with the name in that story. Now, ironically, I guess because we're selling to young kids, the decision was made to put the Mugato into clothes, even though he's really like a gorilla. He never actually wore clothes. But creative license. And now when we get to the very last cover changes that were ever made on the original run of Star Trek action figures, you can see that they have now included the additional 4 characters, giving us a total of 14. And they've removed some of the little white squares talking about the things they were trying to sell us, like the Tribble that never existed. We still have the phaser, the tricorder, the communicator, and the command console.
The Star Trek USS Enterprise gift set with command chair, console, 3 telescreen cards, and 5 Star Trek action figures. Place Mr. Spock or any Star Trek figure into the transporter room. Spin the control knob and press the button. Mr. Spock disappears. Pretend he's left the deck of the Enterprise for outer space adventure. You can capture the Klingon and bring him back to the Enterprise. Star Trek USS Enterprise gift set. Star Trek action figures also sold separately by Mego.